For more now, I'm pleased to say we're joined by someone who works on many of these issues. Representative Jerry Nadler, Democrat from New York, and the man behind the Presumed Guilty Project and co-host of the cycle, my colleague Ari Melber. Congressman, Republicans have repeatedly said, both in the run-up to the sequester and when the sequester had an effect, that it's not a problem. It's not an issue. Is that true as far as the criminal justice system is concerned? Well,
no, unfortunately, it's certainly not true. It's cutting something like 30% or more of funding for the public defender systems. That means that people don't get adequate defenses, or they have to wait for trial for months, and they're in jail, having been convicted of nothing. Many of them are maybe innocent, but you're waiting longer for arraignments. You're waiting longer for trials, months. Even Chief Justice Roberts, no bleeding heart liberal, complained recently that the sequestration would really very much harm the criminal justice system, and it has a disproportionate effect on defendants, as opposed to it'll reduce DAs also. But because the prosecutors on the federal level are funded out of the Department of Justice, which is something like a $30 billion, $27 billion operation, and has some leeway, they can switch funds around, sure. Whereas the public defenders are funded out of a much smaller operation, almost all of which goes to staff salaries for defenders and staff assistants and rent. They have very little leeway, so it really hits the defense much more than the prosecution, and you're going to have a situation where you may start seeing the courts order prisoners freed, as they are being in California now, just for lack of trials.
I was going to mention that. Ari, hasn't this sequester simply amplified all the biases that currently exist within the criminal justice process, particularly when it becomes apparent, as the Congressman has just said, that 30% of defendants who cannot afford counsel are African Americans?
Yeah, I think it does reinforce a lot of problems. The difference here being the sequester may not have been set up to be racist, but it is certainly racially unfair in its impact. That may ultimately prove unconstitutional, as we've been reporting, over the long run. But for right now, as the Congressman said, you have $27 billion there sitting on the DOJ prosecutor side and only $7 billion sitting on the court system side. And one of the most ridiculous parts of this, even from a conservative perspective, and that's why many former prosecutors and now the Chief Justice have spoken out, is that the nature of these cuts punish the parts of the government that are already the most efficient. Our reporting showed that about 90% of public defender budgets in most offices go to people, go to staff. Yes. So there's nothing to cut but people.
Yeah. No,
whereas if you're dealing with a procurement program or someplace that already has 10% waste and overhead, they are fine. They're let off the hook. So it's not logical even from a conservative perspective.
Congressman, when you add the economic pressures to the judicial reverse on the Voting Rights Act, aren't we moving in the wrong direction in terms of civil rights and equality in this country?
Well, in many ways we are, and we have been for quite a while. The Supreme Court's atrocious decision in the Shelby County case overturning the real protections we've had for 50 years on voting rights, and you saw right away in Texas.
Within hours.
Within hours. Texas had enacted a reapportionment plan that a 3-judge federal court in Washington had declared was not only in effect, but intentionally racially discriminatory and therefore illegal. As soon as they threw out the fact that Texas had to get such laws pre-cleared, Texas announced they would effectuate the already declared racially discriminatory redistricting plan, and states are coming up with all these different voter suppression devices. So yes, that plus the effects on the judiciary, and another thing in the judiciary, we've had increasingly in the last 20 years draconian mandatory minimum sentences, which means that a prosecutor, not a judge, really has the negotiating leverage, because a prosecutor says to a defendant, if you don't plead guilty, whether you're guilty or not, if you don't plead guilty, I'll give you a 30-year sentence. If you plead guilty, we'll make it 6 months. Yeah. And the odds, I mean, the disparity is so great that there is tremendous pressure, especially when there isn't adequate legal representation, on even innocent defendants to plead guilty for a minor sentence, rather than risking a 30, 40-year sentence.
Indeed. Thank you for your work in this area, Congressman Jerry Nadler.